Hey everyone. Tonight we journey into one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval life: hygiene. Or rather, the shocking lack of it. We've all heard the jokes about how people in the Middle Ages never bathed, how they threw their waste into the streets, and how they lived in conditions that would make a modern garbage dump look pristine. But the reality was somehow both better and worse than the stereotypes suggest. The truth about medieval hygiene is a complex, fascinating, and often stomach-turning story that reveals just how different life was in an age before germ theory, indoor plumbing, or any real understanding of how disease spread. So before you get too comfortable with those romantic notions of medieval life, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these deep dives into historical realities. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our global community of history lovers settling in for the night with some truly eye-opening stories. Now dim those lights, adjust your pillow, and prepare yourself for a rather sobering journey. Because when it comes to hygiene in the Middle Ages, the truth is far filthier than most people imagine. Picture this. You're walking through the streets of London in the year 1350. It's a warm summer day. And the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the magnificent churches or the bustling market stalls. It's the smell, an overwhelming, nauseating stench that seems to come from everywhere at once, from the gutters running with sewage, from the piles of garbage rotting in corners, from the unwashed bodies of the people around you, from the animal waste that covers the cobblestones, and from the open cesspits that dot the city like festering wounds. You watch as a woman opens her second-story window and empties a chamber pot into the street below, barely bothering to shout a warning to the pedestrians. The contents splash onto the cobblestones, adding to the river of filth that flows down the center of the street. A pig roots through a pile of garbage, competing with rats and stray dogs for scraps. A butcher tosses animal entrails into the gutter, where they'll sit and rot until the next rain washes them away, or more likely, just spreads them around. This was the reality of medieval hygiene, and it was far more complex and nuanced than most people realize. The medieval period wasn't a monolithic dark age where everyone was equally filthy and ignorant. Attitudes toward cleanliness varied enormously depending on the time period, the region, the social class, and the individual. Some medieval people were surprisingly fastidious about personal hygiene, while others lived in conditions that would shock even the most hardened modern sanitation worker. Tonight we're going to explore every aspect of medieval hygiene, from how people bathed or didn't, to how they dealt with human waste, from their dental care to their laundry practices, from their understanding of disease to their attempts at public sanitation. We'll discover why the medieval period saw both sophisticated bathhouses and streets running with sewage, why some people washed daily while others went months without bathing, and why the very concept of cleanliness meant something entirely different than it does today. We'll learn about the role of the church in shaping attitudes toward bathing and bodily cleanliness, about the impact of the Black Death on hygiene practices, and about the surprising sophistication of some medieval sanitation systems. We'll meet the gong farmers who cleaned out cesspits, the barber surgeons who pulled teeth and performed bloodletting, and the ordinary people who struggled to maintain some semblance of cleanliness in a world that seemed designed to make them dirty. Because the truth is, medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, wasn't just about being dirty or clean. It was about survival in a world where disease was poorly understood, where water was often unsafe to drink, where soap was expensive, and where the infrastructure for sanitation was either primitive or non-existent. It was about making choices between competing priorities when resources were scarce and knowledge was limited. The medieval approach to hygiene had profound consequences for health, for social relationships, for economic development, and for the very structure of medieval society. The diseases that flourished in unsanitary conditions killed millions of people and shaped the course of history. The social stigma attached to certain occupations related to waste and cleanliness created rigid class divisions. The lack of understanding about how disease spread led to practices that actually made things worse rather than better. And perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience with hygiene, with all its failures and occasional successes, laid the groundwork for the public health revolutions that would eventually transform human life. The hard lessons learned through centuries of plague, pestilence, and filth would eventually lead to the development of modern sanitation systems, germ theory, and the public health infrastructure that we take for granted today. So let's begin our journey into the filthy, fascinating world of medieval hygiene. Let's discover why you would have struggled to stay clean in this era, why disease was so prevalent, and why the very air you breathed would have been thick with the stench of human existence. Because understanding medieval hygiene isn't just about learning historical trivia. It's about appreciating how far we've come and understanding the enormous challenges that our ancestors faced in their daily struggle for survival. The streets are calling, the cesspits are overflowing, and the truth about medieval hygiene is about to be revealed in all its grimy, smelly, shocking detail. Before we dive into the genuine filth and squalor of medieval life, we need to address one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages. The idea that people in this era never bathed, that they were universally filthy, and that they had no concept of personal hygiene whatsoever. This stereotype, while containing kernels of truth, is actually a gross oversimplification that obscures a much more complex and interesting reality. The myth of the perpetually unwashed medieval person largely originated in the 19th century, when Victorian historians and writers were constructing narratives about the Dark Ages that emphasized the supposed backwardness and barbarism of the medieval period in contrast to their own enlightened era. These narratives served a purpose. They made the Victorians feel superior and justified their own social and political systems. But they weren't entirely accurate. The reality is that attitudes toward bathing and personal cleanliness varied enormously throughout the medieval period, which itself spanned roughly 1,000 years from the 5th to the 15th century. In the early Middle Ages, particularly in areas that had been part of the Roman Empire, public bathhouses remained common, and bathing was a regular part of life. The Romans had been enthusiastic bathers, and their infrastructure and cultural practices didn't disappear overnight when the empire fell. In fact, throughout much of the medieval period, public bathhouses were common in European cities and towns. These establishments, known as stews or bagnios, provided hot baths, steam rooms, and various grooming services. They were social centers where people of all classes would gather to bathe, gossip, conduct business, and sometimes engage in activities that the church frowned upon. The existence of these bathhouses and the regulations governing them suggests that bathing was far more common than the stereotype suggests. Medieval medical texts and advice manuals frequently discussed bathing and personal hygiene. Physicians recommended regular bathing for health reasons, though their understanding of why bathing was beneficial was often based on the theory of humors rather than any concept of germs or bacteria. They believed that bathing helped balance the body's humors and could prevent or cure various ailments. These medical recommendations were taken seriously by those who could afford to follow them. The wealthy and nobility certainly bathed regularly, often in elaborate wooden tubs that would be filled with heated water by servants. These baths might be scented with herbs and flowers, and bathing was often a social activity, with family members or guests sharing the tub. Illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period frequently depict people bathing, suggesting that it was a normal and unremarkable part of life. However, and this is a significant however, attitudes toward bathing began to change in the later Middle Ages, particularly after the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century. The plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, and people desperately sought explanations for this catastrophe. One theory that gained traction was that bathing, particularly in public bathhouses, spread disease by opening the pores and allowing pestilence to enter the body. This theory was completely wrong, of course. The plague was spread by fleas on rats, not by bathing, but it had a profound impact on bathing practices. Public bathhouses began to close, and people became more suspicious of bathing, particularly in hot water. By the 16th century, bathing had become much less common than it had been in earlier periods, and this is when the stereotype of the unwashed medieval person really began to take hold. But even during periods when full-body bathing was less common, people still practiced other forms of hygiene. They would wash their hands and faces regularly, particularly before meals. They would change their linen undergarments, which absorbed sweat and body oils, and the act of changing into clean linen was considered a form of cleanliness. They would use perfumes, pomanders, and scented herbs to mask body odors, and they would groom their hair, trim their nails, and maintain their appearance in various ways. The concept of cleanliness itself was different in the medieval period than it is today. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory, the idea that invisible microorganisms could cause disease, so their approach to cleanliness was based on different principles. They were concerned with visible dirt, with unpleasant odors, and with maintaining social respectability. They believed that disease was caused by bad air, miasma, by imbalances in the body's humors, or by divine punishment. So their hygiene practices were aimed at addressing these perceived causes rather than eliminating germs. Social class played an enormous role in determining hygiene practices. The wealthy could afford servants to heat water for baths, could purchase expensive soaps and perfumes, and could change their clothes regularly. They had access to better housing with more privacy and better sanitation. The poor, on the other hand, often lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions with limited access to clean water and no resources for elaborate hygiene practices. For them, basic survival took precedence over cleanliness. Geographic location also mattered. Cities were generally filthier than rural areas because of the concentration of people and the inadequate infrastructure for dealing with waste. Southern European cities, influenced by Islamic and Byzantine traditions that emphasized bathing and cleanliness, often had better hygiene practices than Northern European cities. Coastal areas had easier access to water for bathing than inland regions. Religious attitudes toward bathing in the body were complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the Church taught that the body was a temple of the Holy Spirit and should be cared for appropriately. Cleanliness was associated with godliness, and monks and nuns were expected to maintain certain standards of hygiene. On the other hand, excessive attention to the body and physical appearance was seen as vanity and a distraction from spiritual concerns. Some religious ascetics deliberately avoided bathing as a form of mortification of the flesh. The Church's attitude toward public bathhouses was particularly ambivalent. These establishments were seen as necessary for public health, but they were also associated with immorality and sin. Bathhouses often employed female attendants who provided services beyond just bathing, and they became known as places where prostitution occurred. The Church repeatedly tried to regulate or close bathhouses, with varying degrees of success. Gender also influenced hygiene practices. Women were generally expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness than men, particularly regarding their appearance and clothing. However, they also faced more restrictions on their access to public bathing facilities and had to navigate complex social rules about modesty and propriety. Pregnant women and menstruating women faced particular taboos and restrictions related to bathing and cleanliness. The seasonal nature of medieval life affected hygiene practices as well. In winter, when water was scarce and heating it was expensive and difficult, bathing became less frequent. In summer, when water was more readily available and the heat made bathing more appealing, people bathed more often. Agricultural cycles also played a role. During busy harvest seasons, people had less time and energy for elaborate hygiene practices. The availability and cost of soap was another crucial factor. Soap was made from animal fats and wood ash, and while it was available throughout the medieval period, it was relatively expensive and not everyone could afford it. The poor might use sand, ash, or other abrasives to clean themselves and their possessions. The quality of soap varied enormously, from crude, harsh soaps that could damage skin to fine, scented soaps that were luxury items. Water quality and availability were perhaps the most important factors affecting medieval hygiene. In many areas, clean water was scarce, and the water that was available was often contaminated with sewage, animal waste, and other pollutants. People knew that some water sources were safer than others, but they didn't understand why. They might avoid water that smelled bad or looked dirty, but they had no way to detect invisible contamination. The infrastructure for water supply varied enormously. Some cities had aqueducts, wells, and public fountains that provided relatively clean water. Others relied on rivers and streams that were also used for waste disposal. In rural areas, people might have their own wells, or might have to walk long distances to fetch water. The effort required to obtain water meant that it was used sparingly and carefully. The myth of the dirty Middle Ages also ignores the significant regional and cultural variations in hygiene practices. Islamic Spain, for example, had a sophisticated bathing culture inherited from Roman and Islamic traditions, with elaborate public baths and a strong emphasis on cleanliness. Byzantine Constantinople maintained Roman bathing traditions throughout the medieval period. Even in Western Europe, practices varied significantly from place to place and time to time. So while it's true that medieval hygiene standards were generally lower than modern standards, and that many medieval people lived in conditions that we would consider filthy, it's not accurate to say that medieval people never bathed or had no concept of cleanliness. They did bathe, they did care about hygiene, and they did make efforts to stay clean, but they did so within the constraints of their knowledge, resources, and cultural context. Understanding this nuanced reality is important because it helps us appreciate the genuine challenges that medieval people faced in maintaining hygiene, rather than simply dismissing them as ignorant or barbaric. It also helps us understand how hygiene practices evolved over time and how they were shaped by factors like disease, religion, economics, and social structure. With this context in mind, we can now explore the specific aspects of medieval hygiene, the bathing practices, the waste disposal methods, the dental care, and all the other elements that made up the complex and often unpleasant reality of staying clean in the Middle Ages. Despite the stereotype of the unwashed medieval person, public bathhouses were actually common and popular throughout much of the Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th through the 15th centuries. These establishments, known by various names, stews, banios, baths, or simply hothouses, were an integral part of urban life and reveal a side of medieval culture that often surprises modern people. But they were also sites of controversy, disease transmission, and social tension that eventually led to their decline. The medieval bathhouse was descended from the Roman thermae, those elaborate public bathing complexes that had been central to Roman social life. When the Roman Empire collapsed in Western Europe, many of these bathhouses fell into disrepair or were destroyed. But the tradition of public bathing didn't disappear entirely. In areas that had been heavily Romanized, and particularly in regions that came under Islamic influence, public bathing remained common throughout the early Middle Ages. By the High Middle Ages, public bathhouses had become widespread in European cities and towns. A large city might have dozens of bathhouses, while even small towns often had at least one. These establishments were regulated by municipal authorities who set standards for their operation, fixed prices, and tried to maintain order and decency. The existence of these regulations tells us that bathhouses were considered important enough to warrant official attention and control. The typical medieval bathhouse was a substantial building, often made of stone to reduce fire risk, with multiple rooms serving different functions. The main bathing room would contain large wooden tubs, sometimes big enough for several people to bathe together. These tubs would be filled with hot water that was heated in a separate room and carried in by bathhouse workers. The water would be changed periodically, but not after every bather, which meant that later bathers were essentially bathing in water that had already been used by others. In addition to the tubs, many bathhouses had steam rooms or sweating rooms, where bathers could sit in hot, humid air to open their pores and promote sweating. This practice was believed to be healthy and cleansing, drawing out impurities from the body. Some bathhouses also had cold plunge pools where bathers could cool off after the hot bath or steam room. This alternation between hot and cold was thought to be particularly beneficial for health. The bathhouse experience was about more than just getting clean. It was a social occasion, a place to relax, gossip, conduct business, and be seen. People would spend hours at the bathhouse, moving between the different rooms, chatting with friends and acquaintances, perhaps having a meal or a drink. For many medieval people, particularly those living in crowded, uncomfortable housing, the bathhouse offered a rare opportunity for comfort and leisure. Bathhouses employed a variety of workers to serve their customers. There were stokers who kept the fires burning to heat the water, carriers who hauled the hot water to the tubs, and attendants who helped customers bathe, scrubbed their backs, and provided various grooming services. Some bathhouses employed barbers who would shave customers, cut their hair, and even perform minor surgical procedures like bloodletting and tooth extraction. The combination of bathing and barbering services under one roof was common and convenient. Female attendants, known as stewholders or bathmaids, were a controversial feature of many bathhouses. These women helped female customers bathe, but they also provided services to male customers that went beyond simple bathing assistance. Many bathhouses became known as places where sexual services were available, and the line between bathhouse attendant and prostitute was often blurred. This association with prostitution would eventually contribute to the decline of bathhouses. The church had a complicated relationship with bathhouses. On one hand, cleanliness was associated with godliness, and bathing was seen as a legitimate and even necessary activity. Many monasteries and convents had their own bathing facilities, and monks and nuns were expected to bathe regularly, though not excessively. On the other hand, public bathhouses were associated with nudity, sensuality, and sexual immorality, which the church condemned. Church authorities repeatedly issued regulations trying to control bathhouse behavior. Mixed gender bathing was often prohibited, with separate hours designated for men and women. Bathhouses were supposed to be closed on Sundays and holy days. Prostitution was officially forbidden, though these rules were often ignored or only sporadically enforced. The church's ambivalence toward bathhouses reflected broader tensions between the body and the spirit, between necessary physical care and dangerous sensual indulgence. The cost of visiting a bathhouse varied depending on the establishment and the services provided, but it was generally affordable for working people. A basic bath might cost a few pennies, while additional services like haircutting, shaving, or massage would cost extra. Some bathhouses offered different levels of service, with private rooms and more elaborate amenities available for wealthier customers. The affordability of bathhouses meant that regular bathing was accessible to a broad cross-section of urban society. Bathhouses served important social functions beyond just hygiene. They were places where people from different social classes might mingle, though there were also exclusive bathhouses that catered only to the wealthy. They were places where business deals were negotiated, where political discussions took place, and where social networks were maintained. For women, who had limited access to public spaces, bathhouses provided one of the few acceptable venues for socializing outside the home. The medical profession endorsed bathing as beneficial for health. Medieval physicians, working within the framework of humoral theory, believed that bathing could help balance the body's humors and cure various ailments. They prescribed specific types of baths for different conditions: hot baths for some ailments, cold baths for others, baths with various herbs and minerals added to the water. Bathhouses sometimes advertised their medicinal benefits and attracted customers seeking health cures as well as simple cleanliness. However, bathhouses also had significant downsides that would eventually lead to their decline. The practice of multiple people bathing in the same water, combined with the warm, humid environment, made bathhouses ideal places for disease transmission. Skin diseases, lice, and other parasites could easily spread from one bather to another. More seriously, bathhouses may have played a role in spreading epidemic diseases, though the exact mechanisms weren't understood at the time. The association between bathhouses and prostitution became increasingly problematic. Municipal authorities and church officials grew concerned about the moral corruption associated with these establishments. Some bathhouses were essentially brothels that happened to have bathing facilities, and they attracted criminal elements and contributed to social disorder. Efforts to regulate or reform bathhouses were often unsuccessful, leading to calls for their closure. The Black Death, which struck Europe in 1348 and returned in subsequent waves, fundamentally changed attitudes toward bathing. As people desperately sought explanations for the plague, some physicians theorized that bathing, particularly in hot water, opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to pestilential air. This theory was completely wrong. The plague was spread by fleas on rats, not by bathing, but it was widely believed and had a profound impact on bathing practices. After the Black Death, bathhouses began to close throughout Europe. Some were shut down by authorities concerned about disease transmission. Others closed because people were afraid to visit them. Still others were closed because of their association with immorality and prostitution. By the 16th century, public bathhouses had largely disappeared from most of Europe, and bathing became much less common than it had been in earlier periods. The decline of bathhouses had significant consequences for public health and hygiene. Without access to affordable public bathing facilities, many people, particularly the poor, bathed much less frequently. This contributed to the spread of diseases, particularly those transmitted by body lice, such as typhus. The loss of bathhouses also eliminated an important social space and changed the nature of urban life. Some regions maintained bathing traditions longer than others. In Islamic Spain and the Ottoman Empire, public baths remained common and popular. In Scandinavia, the tradition of sauna bathing continued. In Russia, the banya, steam bath, remained an important part of culture. But in most of Western Europe, public bathing largely disappeared and wouldn't return until the 19th century, when new understandings of hygiene and disease led to the construction of modern public baths. The medieval bathhouse, then, represents both the sophistication and the limitations of medieval hygiene practices. These establishments showed that medieval people did value cleanliness and were willing to invest resources in maintaining it. They demonstrated an understanding that bathing was beneficial for health and social well-being, but they also revealed the dangers of bathing practices that didn't account for disease transmission, and they became entangled with moral and social issues that ultimately led to their demise. If you had lived in a medieval city during the height of bathhouse culture, you would likely have visited one regularly, perhaps once a week or more. You would have enjoyed the warmth, the cleanliness, and the social atmosphere. But you would also have been exposed to diseases, to moral temptations, and to social tensions that made the bathhouse a contested and controversial space. And if you had lived in the later Middle Ages, after the bathhouses closed, you would have found it much more difficult to maintain personal hygiene, contributing to the stereotype of the dirty medieval person that persists to this day. If bathing practices in the Middle Ages were more sophisticated than commonly believed, the same cannot be said for medieval toilet facilities and waste disposal. This is where the stereotype of medieval filth becomes uncomfortably accurate. The methods that medieval people used to deal with human waste were primitive, unsanitary, and often downright disgusting, creating conditions that bred disease and made daily life unpleasant for everyone, regardless of social class. Let's start with the most basic question. Where did medieval people go to the bathroom? The answer varied enormously depending on whether you lived in a castle, a townhouse, or a rural cottage, but none of the options would meet modern standards of hygiene or comfort. In castles and manor houses, the wealthy had access to a feature called a garderobe, essentially a small room or closet built into the thickness of the castle wall, with a stone or wooden seat containing a hole. The waste would drop down a shaft built into the wall and exit through an opening at the base of the castle, either falling into the moat, a cesspit, or simply onto the ground outside. The term garderobe literally means wardrobe, and these rooms were sometimes used to store clothes because it was believed that the ammonia fumes from the waste would help repel moths and other insects. The garderobe was a significant improvement over having no toilet facilities at all, but it was far from pleasant. The shaft would become encrusted with waste, creating a permanent stench that permeated the room. In winter, sitting on a cold stone seat in a drafty tower was an uncomfortable experience, and the waste that accumulated at the base of the castle created a foul-smelling mess that attracted flies and rats. Some castles had multiple garderobes at different levels, all emptying into the same shaft, which meant that using a lower garderobe carried the risk of being hit by waste from above. In urban houses, most people didn't have anything as sophisticated as a garderobe. Instead, they used chamber pots, simple ceramic or metal containers that would be kept in the bedroom or another convenient location. These pots would be used during the night or when it was inconvenient to go outside, and then they would need to be emptied. And here's where things get really unpleasant. The standard method for emptying a chamber pot was to simply throw the contents out the window into the street below. In theory, you were supposed to shout a warning first. In England, the cry was "Gardez-l'eau," a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." In practice, this warning was often not given, or was given too late for pedestrians to get out of the way. Walking through medieval city streets meant constantly watching for falling waste and being prepared to dodge at a moment's notice. The waste that was thrown into the streets would accumulate in the gutters that ran down the center or sides of the street. These gutters were supposed to carry the waste away, ideally to a river or stream, but they often became clogged with garbage, dead animals, and other debris. The result was that streets were frequently covered with a layer of filth that could be several inches deep. In dry weather, this would dry out and create clouds of foul-smelling dust. In wet weather, it would turn into a noxious mud that splashed onto people's clothes and made walking treacherous. Some cities attempted to regulate waste disposal. London, for example, passed laws requiring that waste be carried to designated dumping areas rather than thrown into the streets. Paris had similar regulations, but these laws were difficult to enforce and many people simply ignored them. The fines for illegal waste disposal were often small enough that people preferred to pay them rather than go to the trouble of properly disposing of their waste. For those who didn't have access to a chamber pot or who needed to relieve themselves while out and about, the options were limited and unpleasant. Some cities had public latrines, simple structures with seats over pits or channels that carried waste away. These facilities were often crowded, filthy, and offered no privacy. Many people preferred to simply find a quiet corner, alley, or courtyard and relieve themselves there, adding to the general filth of the urban environment. Rural areas had their own waste disposal challenges. Peasants living in small cottages typically had an outhouse, a simple wooden structure built over a pit dug in the ground. These outhouses were usually located some distance from the house to minimize the smell, but not so far as to be inconvenient, especially at night or in bad weather. The pit would gradually fill up with waste, and when it was full, it would either be covered over and a new pit dug, or the waste would be removed and used as fertilizer for crops. The use of human waste as fertilizer was common in rural areas and was actually a sensible practice from an agricultural standpoint. Human waste contains nitrogen and other nutrients that plants need, and using it as fertilizer helped maintain soil fertility. However, this practice also spread parasites and diseases, particularly if the waste wasn't properly composted before being applied to fields. Vegetables grown in fields fertilized with human waste could transmit intestinal parasites and other pathogens to those who ate them. The accumulation of waste in cities created a need for people to remove it, leading to one of the most unpleasant occupations in medieval society, the gong farmer. These men, also called night soil men or rakers, were responsible for cleaning out cesspits, privies, and sewers. They typically worked at night, both to avoid offending people with the sight and smell of their work, and because the waste was easier to remove when it had cooled down from the day's heat. Gong farmers would descend into cesspits, sometimes standing waist-deep in human waste, and shovel it into buckets that would be hauled up and loaded onto carts. The waste would then be taken outside the city and dumped or sold to farmers as fertilizer. This was dangerous, disgusting work. The fumes from the waste could be toxic, causing gong farmers to pass out or even die from asphyxiation. The risk of disease was enormous, and the social stigma attached to the occupation was severe. Gong farmers were often required to live in separate areas and were excluded from many social activities. Despite the unpleasantness and danger of the work, gong farmers were well paid by medieval standards, precisely because so few people were willing to do the job. In London, gong farmers were licensed by the city and could earn several times what an ordinary laborer made. Some became relatively wealthy, though their money couldn't buy them social respectability. The high pay reflects both the necessity of the work and the extreme reluctance of people to do it. The cesspits that gong farmers cleaned were a ubiquitous feature of medieval cities. These were pits dug beneath houses or in courtyards lined with stone or wood where waste would accumulate. In theory, cesspits were supposed to be watertight to prevent contamination of groundwater, but in practice, they often leaked, seeping waste into the surrounding soil and into wells. This contamination of water supplies was a major source of disease, though medieval people didn't understand the connection. Some cities had more sophisticated waste disposal systems. London had a network of sewers, some dating back to Roman times, that carried waste from public latrines and some private houses to the Thames. However, these sewers were often inadequate for the city's growing population, and they frequently became clogged. Paris had a similar system, with sewers emptying into the Seine. But these early sewer systems were primitive compared to modern ones, and they did little to prevent the contamination of water supplies or the spread of disease. The rivers that ran through medieval cities served multiple conflicting purposes. They were sources of drinking water, transportation routes, power sources for mills, and sewers for waste disposal. This meant that people were often drinking water that was contaminated with sewage, leading to outbreaks of waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Medieval people knew that some water sources were safer than others. They preferred water from springs or wells to river water, but they didn't understand why, and they had no effective methods for purifying contaminated water. The smell of medieval cities was overwhelming and inescapable. The combination of human and animal waste, rotting garbage, industrial pollution from tanneries and dye works, and the general lack of sanitation created an olfactory assault that modern people would find unbearable. Medieval people became accustomed to these smells to some degree, but they were still bothered by them. The wealthy used perfumes, pomanders, and scented herbs to mask unpleasant odors, while the poor simply had to endure them. The connection between filth and disease was not understood in the Middle Ages. The prevailing medical theory held that disease was caused by miasma, bad air, or foul odors. This theory was wrong, but it did lead to some beneficial practices. People tried to avoid areas with particularly bad smells, which often meant avoiding the most contaminated areas. They used aromatic herbs and spices, which, while they didn't actually prevent disease, at least made the environment more pleasant. And they recognized that some locations were healthier than others, even if they didn't understand why. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that medieval waste disposal practices actually contributed to the spread of illness. The contamination of water supplies with sewage led to outbreaks of waterborne diseases. The accumulation of waste in streets attracted rats, which carried fleas that transmitted plague. The use of human waste as fertilizer spread intestinal parasites. The crowded, unsanitary conditions in cities created ideal environments for epidemic diseases to flourish. Children were particularly vulnerable to diseases caused by poor sanitation. Infant and child mortality rates were extremely high in medieval cities, with perhaps half of all children dying before the age of 5. Many of these deaths were caused by diarrheal diseases resulting from contaminated water and food. Parents had no way to protect their children from these invisible threats, and the loss of children to disease was a tragic but common experience. The social and economic costs of poor sanitation were enormous. Epidemic diseases killed millions of people and disrupted economic activity. The unpleasantness of urban environments drove wealthy people to spend as much time as possible in rural estates, where the air was cleaner and the smells less overwhelming. The need to employ gong farmers and other sanitation workers represented a significant expense for cities. And the general filthiness of medieval life contributed to a sense of fatalism and resignation that affected people's outlook and behavior. If you had lived in a medieval city, dealing with human waste would have been a constant, unpleasant part of your daily life. You would have had to empty chamber pots, navigate filthy streets, endure overwhelming smells, and live with the constant risk of disease from contaminated water and food. You would have accepted these conditions as normal, because you had no alternative and no understanding of how things could be different, and you would have been part of a society where the most basic aspects of sanitation were handled in ways that we would now consider not just primitive, but actively dangerous to public health. If you think medieval waste disposal was bad, wait until you hear about medieval dental care, or rather, the almost complete lack of it. The state of medieval teeth and the primitive, painful methods used to treat dental problems represent one of the most visceral examples of how different life was in an age before modern medicine. The medieval mouth was a place of constant pain, progressive decay, and eventual tooth loss that affected not just health, but also appearance, speech, and the ability to eat. Let's start with the basic fact. Medieval people had terrible teeth. By modern standards, almost everyone in the Middle Ages would have had significant dental problems by their 20s or 30s. Cavities were common, gum disease was endemic, and tooth loss was so prevalent that having a full set of teeth past middle age was rare. The reasons for this dental disaster were multiple and interconnected. First, the medieval diet was hard on teeth in ways that modern diets are not. Bread, the staple food for most people, was made from coarsely ground flour that often contained bits of stone from the grinding process. Eating this gritty bread gradually wore down tooth enamel, exposing the softer dentin beneath and making teeth more vulnerable to decay. The constant grinding action also wore down the chewing surfaces of teeth, sometimes down to the gum line. Second, while medieval people consumed less refined sugar than modern people do, they still ate foods that promoted tooth decay. Honey was used as a sweetener, and while it was expensive and not available to everyone, those who could afford it consumed it regularly. Dried fruits, which were popular and more widely available, are also high in natural sugars that feed the bacteria that cause cavities. And the medieval practice of eating soft, cooked foods rather than raw, crunchy vegetables meant that teeth weren't naturally cleaned by the mechanical action of chewing. Third, oral hygiene practices were primitive and often ineffective. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist in medieval Europe. Instead, people used a variety of methods to clean their teeth with varying degrees of success. Some people used a cloth to rub their teeth, which could remove some surface debris but didn't clean between teeth or below the gum line. Others used twigs from certain trees, fraying the end to create a primitive brush. These chew sticks were actually reasonably effective if used properly, but they required time and effort that many people didn't invest. Some medieval people used tooth powders made from various substances. Recipes for these powders included ingredients like crushed salt, crushed herbs, ground pumice stone, and even crushed brick or pottery. These abrasive powders could remove stains and some plaque, but they could also damage tooth enamel if used too vigorously. The wealthy might use more sophisticated tooth powders containing expensive spices and herbs, but the basic principle was the same: scrub the teeth with something abrasive. Rinsing the mouth with water or wine was another common practice. Medieval medical texts recommended rinsing after meals to remove food particles, and this advice was sound, even if people didn't understand the mechanism by which it helped. Some people used mouthwashes made from herbs like mint, sage, or rosemary, which had some antibacterial properties and at least made the breath smell better. Despite these efforts, dental decay was inevitable for most people. Once a cavity formed, there was no way to fill it or stop its progression. The decay would gradually eat away at the tooth, eventually reaching the pulp chamber where the nerve was located. At this point, the pain would become excruciating, a constant, throbbing agony that made eating, sleeping, and concentrating impossible. Medieval people described toothache as one of the worst pains imaginable, and they were right. The treatments available for dental problems were limited and often made things worse. For minor problems like bad breath or inflamed gums, people might use herbal remedies, chewing on certain herbs, applying poultices to the gums, or rinsing with herbal infusions. Some of these remedies had genuine medicinal properties. Clove oil, for example, contains eugenol, which has analgesic and antibacterial effects and is still used in dentistry today. But most herbal remedies were only marginally effective at best. For more serious problems like abscessed teeth, the only real solution was extraction. And this is where things get truly horrifying. Tooth extraction in the Middle Ages was performed without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and often without much skill or care. The person performing the extraction might be a barber surgeon, a blacksmith, or simply someone in the community who had a reputation for being good at pulling teeth. The procedure was brutal. The patient would be held down by assistants while the tooth puller used a variety of tools, pliers, forceps, or even just their fingers, to grip the tooth and wrench it out of the jaw. The pain was indescribable. Patients would scream, struggle, and sometimes pass out from the agony. The tooth might break during extraction, leaving fragments in the jaw that would become infected. The socket would bleed profusely, and there was always a risk of infection that could spread to the jawbone or even to the brain. After extraction, the patient was left with a bleeding socket and instructions to rinse with wine or salt water. If they were lucky, the socket would heal without complications. If they were unlucky, they might develop a serious infection that could be fatal. Even in the best case, they were left with a gap in their teeth that would affect their ability to chew, their speech, and their appearance. Some medieval tooth pullers were more skilled than others. The best ones understood anatomy, used appropriate tools, and tried to minimize damage to the surrounding tissues. But even the most skilled practitioner was working without the benefits of modern knowledge and technology. They couldn't see inside the tooth to understand the extent of decay or infection. They couldn't numb the area to reduce pain. They couldn't prescribe antibiotics to prevent or treat infection. They were essentially working blind, relying on experience and intuition. The social stigma of missing teeth was significant. A full set of white, healthy teeth was associated with youth, beauty, and vitality. Missing or decayed teeth were signs of age, poverty, and declining health. People who had lost their front teeth might be reluctant to smile or speak in public. The wealthy sometimes had false teeth made from ivory, bone, or even teeth extracted from corpses or purchased from poor people. These prosthetics were uncomfortable, didn't work very well, and often fell out at embarrassing moments. But they were better than nothing. The connection between dental health and overall health was not well understood in the Middle Ages. Medieval physicians knew that dental problems could cause pain and difficulty eating, but they didn't realize that dental infections could spread to other parts of the body and cause serious systemic illness. Abscessed teeth could lead to infections of the jaw, the sinuses, or even the brain. The bacteria from gum disease could enter the bloodstream and affect the heart and other organs. Many deaths that were attributed to other causes may actually have been caused or contributed to by dental infections. Children's dental health was particularly poor. Baby teeth would decay and fall out prematurely, and permanent teeth would often come in already damaged. Parents had no way to prevent this and no effective treatments. Children would suffer from toothaches, infections, and the social stigma of bad teeth. The pain and difficulty eating caused by dental problems could affect children's growth and development. The wealthy had somewhat better dental health than the poor, but not by much. They could afford better food, including softer bread made from finely ground flour. They could afford tooth powders and mouthwashes. They could afford to have teeth extracted by more skilled practitioners. But they were also more likely to consume sugar and honey, which promoted tooth decay. And they were just as vulnerable to the fundamental problem, the lack of effective preventive care and treatment. Some medieval medical texts contained surprisingly sophisticated advice about dental care. They recommended regular cleaning of teeth, avoiding excessive consumption of sweets, and seeking treatment for dental problems early before they became serious. But this advice was often ignored or was simply impractical for most people to follow. And even when people did follow it, it wasn't enough to prevent the inevitable progression of dental disease. The psychological impact of chronic dental pain and progressive tooth loss was significant. People lived with constant or recurring pain that affected their mood, their sleep, and their ability to function. They watched their teeth gradually decay and fall out, knowing that there was nothing they could do to stop the process. They faced social embarrassment and practical difficulties in eating and speaking. This ongoing dental nightmare was just one more burden in lives that were already filled with hardship and suffering. If you had lived in the Middle Ages, you would almost certainly have experienced serious dental problems by your 30s. You would have endured toothaches that made you wish for death. You would have faced the terrifying prospect of having teeth extracted without anesthesia. You would have gradually lost teeth until eating became difficult and your appearance was marred by gaps and decay. And you would have accepted all of this as normal because everyone around you was experiencing the same dental nightmare. The medieval mouth was a place of pain, decay, and progressive destruction. It was a constant reminder of the limitations of medieval medicine and the harsh realities of life in an age before modern dentistry. And it was yet another way in which medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, made daily life uncomfortable, unhealthy, and often agonizing. While personal bathing and dental care were challenging in the Middle Ages, at least they were relatively quick processes. Laundry, on the other hand, was an exhausting, time-consuming ordeal that could take an entire day or more and required enormous amounts of physical labor. The process of washing clothes in the medieval period was so difficult that most people owned very few garments and wore them until they were literally falling apart. Understanding medieval laundry practices helps us appreciate both the ingenuity of medieval people and the enormous gulf between their daily lives and ours. Let's start with the basic fact that most medieval people owned very few clothes. A typical peasant might own 1 or 2 sets of outer garments, a tunic or dress, perhaps a cloak for cold weather, and a few linen undergarments. The wealthy owned more, of course, but even they had far fewer clothes than a modern person of similar social status. This scarcity meant that clothes had to last for years, and keeping them clean was essential to making them last. The medieval approach to laundry was based on the understanding that the linen undergarments that were worn next to the skin absorbed sweat, body oils, and dirt, protecting the more expensive outer garments. The strategy was to change and wash the linen frequently, while washing the outer garments much less often. This made sense given the difficulty of the washing process, and the need to preserve expensive woolen or silk outer garments that could be damaged by frequent washing. The process of washing clothes began with gathering water, which was itself a significant undertaking. Water had to be drawn from a well, carried from a river or stream, or collected from rain. For a large wash, you might need dozens of gallons of water, all of which had to be transported by hand in buckets or jugs. This was backbreaking work, and it was almost always done by women or by servants if the household could afford them. Once you had water, you needed to heat it. Cold water alone wasn't effective at removing dirt and oils, so water had to be heated over a fire. This required fuel, wood, peat, or dried dung, which had to be gathered or purchased. Building and maintaining a fire hot enough to heat large quantities of water took time and skill. The water would be heated in large cauldrons or kettles, and the process of heating enough water for a full wash could take hours. While the water was heating, you would prepare the cleaning agents. Soap existed in the Middle Ages, but it was expensive and not everyone could afford it. Medieval soap was made from animal fats and wood ash, and it was harsh and caustic, nothing like modern gentle soaps. It could damage delicate fabrics and irritate skin, so it had to be used carefully. The poor often couldn't afford soap at all and had to use alternatives. The most common soap substitute was lye, made from wood ash mixed with water. Lye is highly alkaline and quite effective at breaking down oils and dirt, but it's also caustic and can burn skin and damage fabrics if not used carefully. Another option was urine, which contains ammonia and was actually quite effective as a cleaning agent. Urine was collected in pots and allowed to age, which increased its ammonia content. While this sounds disgusting to modern sensibilities, it was a practical and effective solution that made use of a readily available resource. Some people used other substances to help clean clothes. Fuller's earth, a type of clay, was used to absorb oils and dirt from woolen fabrics. Soapwort, a plant that produces a soapy lather when crushed and mixed with water, was another option. Various herbs and plants were used for their cleaning properties or to add pleasant scents to the wash. Once the water was hot and the cleaning agents prepared, the actual washing could begin. Clothes would be placed in a large tub or barrel filled with hot water and cleaning agent. They would then be pounded, beaten, and agitated to work the cleaning solution through the fabric and loosen dirt. This was done using a wooden paddle or stick, or sometimes just by hand. The physical effort required was enormous. Imagine spending hours beating wet, heavy fabric with a stick. For heavily soiled items or for woolen cloth that needed to be cleaned and thickened, a process called fulling was used. The cloth would be placed in a trough with water and fuller's earth or urine, and then trampled underfoot for hours. This pounding action cleaned the cloth and also caused the wool fibers to mat together, creating a denser, more water-resistant fabric. Fulling was such hard work that it was often done by professional fullers, and in some areas, water-powered fulling mills were built to mechanize the process. After washing, clothes had to be rinsed to remove the cleaning agents. This required more water, more heating, and more physical labor. Clothes would be rinsed multiple times to ensure that all the soap or lye was removed, as residue could irritate skin and damage fabric. Each rinse required lifting the heavy waterlogged garments out of one tub and into another. Once rinsed, clothes had to be wrung out to remove as much water as possible. This was done by hand, twisting the fabric to squeeze out the water. Wringing out heavy, wet woolen garments required significant strength and could leave your hands sore and chapped. Some people used a device called a wringer or mangle, two rollers that the fabric was passed between to squeeze out water. But these were not common in ordinary households. After wringing, clothes had to be dried. In good weather, they would be spread on bushes, hung on lines, or laid on the ground to dry in the sun. The sun's ultraviolet light actually had a mild bleaching and sanitizing effect, which was beneficial even though medieval people didn't understand why. In bad weather or during winter, drying clothes was much more difficult. They might be hung near the fire, but this was risky as they could easily catch fire or be damaged by smoke. Drying could take days in damp weather, and clothes might develop a musty smell or even mildew. For white linen garments, there was an additional step: bleaching. Medieval people valued white linen as a sign of cleanliness and status, but keeping linen white was challenging. The bleaching process involved spreading damp linen in the sun, sometimes for days or weeks, and periodically wetting it with water or buttermilk. The sun would gradually bleach the fabric, but the process was slow and required constant attention. Some people used other bleaching agents like lye or urine, but these could damage the fabric if not used carefully. The entire laundry process, from gathering water to drying the final garment, could easily take a full day or more. It was physically exhausting work that left women with sore muscles, chapped hands, and aching backs. It's no wonder that laundry was typically done only once a week, or even less frequently for outer garments. The sheer amount of labor involved meant that keeping clothes clean was a constant struggle. Professional laundresses existed in medieval cities and towns. These women would wash clothes for wealthy households or for people who couldn't do their own laundry. Laundresses were often poor women who needed to earn money, and the work was hard and poorly paid. They would typically work at rivers or streams, where water was readily available, and they would spend their days kneeling on the riverbank, pounding clothes on stones. The work was hard on their bodies, and many laundresses suffered from chronic back pain, arthritis, and other ailments. The rivers and streams where laundry was done were also used for other purposes, as sources of drinking water, for watering animals, and for disposing of waste. This meant that the water used for washing clothes was often contaminated, and the process of washing could actually spread disease rather than prevent it. Clothes washed in contaminated water could harbor bacteria and parasites that would then be transferred to the wearer's skin. The difficulty of doing laundry had social and economic implications. The wealthy could afford to own more clothes and to hire servants or laundresses to wash them, which meant they could maintain higher standards of cleanliness. The poor, who owned few clothes and had to do their own laundry, often wore dirty, smelly garments simply because they didn't have the time, energy, or resources to wash them more frequently. The condition of a person's clothes was a visible marker of social status. Clean, well-maintained clothes indicated wealth and respectability. Dirty, tattered clothes marked you as poor and potentially disreputable. This meant that people who couldn't afford to keep their clothes clean faced social stigma, in addition to the health risks of wearing dirty garments. Children's clothes were particularly difficult to keep clean, as children were constantly getting dirty through play and work. Parents had to balance the need to keep children's clothes clean with the enormous effort required to do laundry. Many children simply wore dirty clothes most of the time, which contributed to the spread of diseases and parasites. The seasonal nature of medieval life affected laundry practices. In summer, when water was more readily available and clothes dried quickly, laundry was somewhat easier. In winter, when water sources might freeze and drying was difficult, laundry became even more challenging. Some people simply wore dirty clothes through the winter and did a major wash in the spring. The development of better laundry technology was slow. Water-powered fulling mills represented a significant advance, but they were used primarily for processing woolen cloth in the textile industry, rather than for household laundry. The invention of the washboard, which made scrubbing clothes easier, didn't occur until the 18th century. The development of modern washing machines and detergents in the 19th and 20th centuries finally made laundry a manageable task rather than an exhausting ordeal. If you had lived in the Middle Ages, doing laundry would have been one of the most dreaded and exhausting tasks you faced. You would have spent hours hauling water, heating it, pounding clothes, rinsing, wringing, and drying. Your hands would have been chapped and sore from the harsh cleaning agents and the constant immersion in water. Your back would have ached from bending over tubs and beating wet fabric. And despite all this effort, your clothes would never have been as clean as modern clothes, and they would have worn out quickly from the harsh treatment. The medieval laundry ordeal was yet another example of how much harder daily life was in an age before modern technology and conveniences. It was a task that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy, that was hard on the body, and that was never truly finished. As soon as one wash was done, clothes were getting dirty again, and the cycle would begin anew. If you think the challenges of bathing, waste disposal, dental care, and laundry made medieval life unpleasant, we haven't even gotten to one of the most pervasive and disgusting aspects of medieval hygiene: the constant presence of parasites. Lice, fleas, bed bugs, intestinal worms, and other parasites were so common in the Middle Ages that they were simply accepted as a normal part of life. Everyone had them, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble, and the constant itching, biting, and disease transmission they caused made life miserable for everyone. Let's start with lice, which came in 3 varieties that plagued medieval people. Head lice lived in the hair on the scalp, body lice lived in clothing and bedding, and pubic lice lived in the coarse hair of the genital area. All 3 types fed on human blood, and their bites caused intense itching. But beyond the discomfort, lice were also vectors for serious diseases, particularly body lice, which transmitted typhus, trench fever, and relapsing fever. Head lice were ubiquitous. Children were particularly prone to infestations, and lice would spread rapidly through families and communities. The lice themselves were visible to the naked eye, small, grayish insects about the size of a sesame seed. And their eggs, called nits, were even more obvious, appearing as tiny white specks attached to individual hairs. Medieval people would spend hours picking lice and nits out of each other's hair, a practice called grooming or lousing. This was both a practical necessity and a social activity, a way for family members and friends to bond while dealing with a shared problem. Various remedies were tried to combat head lice. People would wash their hair with strong-smelling substances like vinegar, sulfur, or mercury compounds, hoping to kill or repel the lice. They would comb their hair with fine-toothed combs designed to catch lice and nits. They would apply oils or greases to suffocate the lice. Some people even shaved their heads entirely, though this was more common among monks and nuns than among the general population. Despite all these efforts, lice infestations were nearly impossible to eliminate completely and would quickly return. Body lice were even more problematic than head lice because they transmitted serious diseases. These lice lived not on the body itself, but in clothing and bedding, coming out to feed on blood and then returning to the fabric. The lice would lay their eggs in the seams of clothing, where they were protected and could hatch into new generations of parasites. Body lice thrived in the conditions of medieval life. People wore the same clothes for extended periods, rarely washed them, and often slept in their clothes or in bedding that was never cleaned. The diseases transmitted by body lice were devastating. Typhus, also known as jail fever or camp fever, was a bacterial infection that caused high fever, severe headache, and a characteristic rash. It was often fatal, particularly in crowded, unsanitary conditions like prisons, military camps, and besieged cities. Typhus epidemics killed millions of people throughout the medieval period and continued to be a major killer until the 20th century, when improved hygiene and the development of antibiotics finally brought it under control. Fleas were another constant torment. These tiny, jumping insects fed on the blood of humans and animals, and their bites caused itchy red welts. But fleas were more than just a nuisance. They were the primary vector for bubonic plague, the disease that killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population during the Black Death of the 14th century. The fleas that transmitted plague lived primarily on rats, but they would also bite humans, transmitting the bacteria that caused the disease. Medieval people didn't understand the connection between fleas, rats, and plague. They knew that plague seemed to spread from person to person and from place to place, but they attributed this to bad air, divine punishment, or the influence of the stars. They didn't realize that the fleas jumping from infected rats to humans were the actual mechanism of transmission. This lack of understanding meant that efforts to control plague were often misdirected and ineffective. Fleas were so common in medieval homes that people barely noticed them. They would jump from clothing to bedding to furniture, biting anyone who came near. People would try to catch and kill fleas, but this was a losing battle. For every flea you caught, dozens more were hiding in the cracks and crevices of your home. Some people used flea traps, pieces of cloth or fur that would attract fleas, which could then be shaken out and burned. But these were only marginally effective. Bedbugs were yet another parasitic scourge. These flat, reddish-brown insects hid in the cracks of bed frames, in mattresses, and in bedding during the day, emerging at night to feed on sleeping humans. Their bites caused itchy welts and could lead to secondary infections from scratching. Bedbugs were extremely difficult to eliminate once they infested a home, and they could survive for months without feeding, waiting patiently for their next meal. Medieval beds were ideal habitats for bedbugs. The straw or feather mattresses provided plenty of hiding places, and the wooden bed frames had numerous cracks and crevices where bedbugs could shelter. The practice of hanging bed curtains, while providing some privacy and warmth, also created a dark, enclosed space that bedbugs loved. Some people tried to combat bedbugs by regularly changing bedding, by washing bed frames with strong-smelling substances, or by using herbs that were believed to repel insects, but these measures were rarely effective. Intestinal parasites were another major problem, though they were less visible than lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Roundworms, tapeworms, and other intestinal worms infected a large percentage of the medieval population, particularly in areas where sanitation was poor and where human waste was used as fertilizer. These parasites were transmitted through contaminated food and water, and they could cause a range of symptoms from mild discomfort to severe malnutrition and even death. Roundworms were particularly common. These worms, which could grow to be several inches long, lived in the intestines and fed on partially digested food. Heavy infestations could cause abdominal pain, diarrhea, and malnutrition, particularly in children. The worms would occasionally be passed in the stool, where they would be visible as white, thread-like creatures. Medieval people recognized these worms and understood that they were parasites, but they had limited ability to treat them. Tapeworms were even more disturbing. These segmented worms could grow to be many feet long, living in the intestines and absorbing nutrients from the host's food. People infected with tapeworms might notice segments of the worm in their stool, or they might experience vague symptoms like hunger, weight loss, and abdominal discomfort. Medieval medical texts described tapeworms and recommended various herbal remedies to expel them, but these treatments were often ineffective. The prevalence of intestinal parasites was directly related to poor sanitation and hygiene practices. The use of human waste as fertilizer meant that parasite eggs in the waste would contaminate crops, particularly vegetables that were eaten raw or lightly cooked. Contaminated water was another major source of infection, and the lack of hand washing, particularly after using the toilet and before eating, meant that parasite eggs were easily transferred from contaminated surfaces to food and then to the mouth. Medieval people did recognize that parasites were a problem and tried various methods to combat them. For external parasites like lice and fleas, they used strong-smelling substances, fine-toothed combs, and frequent grooming. For internal parasites, they used herbal remedies that were believed to expel worms, substances like wormwood, tansy, and garlic. Some of these remedies had genuine anti-parasitic properties, though they were often not strong enough to completely eliminate heavy infestations. The social and psychological impact of constant parasitic infestation was significant. The itching and discomfort were constant distractions that made it difficult to sleep, work, or concentrate. The visible presence of lice and nits was embarrassing and socially stigmatizing, even though everyone had them. The knowledge that your body was hosting parasites was disturbing and contributed to a general sense of disgust with the physical body. Children were particularly affected by parasites. They were more likely to have heavy infestations because of their close contact with other children and their less developed immune systems. Parasites could stunt children's growth and development by causing malnutrition and chronic illness. Parents would spend hours grooming their children, picking out lice and nits, but the parasites would always return. The wealthy had somewhat better success at controlling parasites than the poor, but they were far from immune. They could afford to change their clothes more frequently, to wash their bedding more often, and to use expensive remedies and treatments. They could hire servants to do the tedious work of grooming and delousing, but they still lived in a world where parasites were ubiquitous, and they still suffered from infestations, just perhaps less severely than the poor. The connection between parasites and disease was not understood in the Middle Ages. People knew that lice, fleas, and other parasites were unpleasant, but they didn't realize that these creatures were transmitting deadly diseases. They didn't understand that the flea bites that caused itchy welts could also transmit plague, or that the body lice that lived in their clothes could transmit typhus. This lack of understanding meant that efforts to control parasites were motivated primarily by comfort rather than by disease prevention. The development of effective methods for controlling parasites came slowly. The invention of better soaps and detergents made it easier to wash clothes and bedding thoroughly. The development of insecticides in the 19th and 20th centuries finally provided effective tools for killing lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Improvements in sanitation and water treatment reduced the transmission of intestinal parasites, and the discovery of anti-parasitic drugs made it possible to treat infestations effectively. If you had lived in the Middle Ages, you would have been constantly infested with parasites. You would have had lice in your hair, fleas in your clothes, bedbugs in your bed, and probably worms in your intestines. You would have spent hours every week grooming yourself and your family members, picking out lice and nits. You would have scratched constantly at flea and bedbug bites. You would have accepted all of this as normal because everyone around you was experiencing the same thing. And you would have had no idea that these parasites were not just uncomfortable, but were also transmitting diseases that could kill you. The plague of parasites was one of the most pervasive and inescapable aspects of medieval life. It was a constant reminder of the limitations of medieval hygiene and the enormous gulf between medieval and modern standards of cleanliness. And it was yet another way in which medieval life was uncomfortable, unhealthy, and often unbearable by modern standards. We've covered many aspects of medieval hygiene: bathing, waste disposal, dental care, laundry, and parasites. But we haven't yet addressed what might be the most disturbing aspect of medieval sanitation: the handling of the dead. In an age when death was far more common and visible than it is today, when infant mortality was high and epidemic diseases could kill thousands in a matter of weeks, the disposal of corpses was a constant challenge that had profound implications for public health and hygiene. Death was an ever-present reality in medieval life. The average life expectancy was somewhere between 30 and 40 years, though this figure is skewed by high infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s, but you would have witnessed the deaths of many family members, friends, and neighbors along the way. Death from disease, accident, violence, and childbirth was common, and everyone lived with the knowledge that they or their loved ones could die at any moment. When someone died, the body had to be dealt with quickly, particularly in warm weather when decomposition would begin within hours. The standard practice was to wash the body, dress it in clean clothes or a shroud, and then display it in the home for a period of mourning before burial. This wake or viewing allowed family and friends to pay their respects and say goodbye, but it also meant that a decomposing corpse was present in the home for a day or more, creating unpleasant odors and attracting flies. The washing of the corpse was typically done by women, often family members or professional layers out of the dead. This was considered a final act of care and respect for the deceased, but it was also an unpleasant and potentially dangerous task. The body would be stripped, washed with water and sometimes with wine or vinegar, and then dressed in clean clothes or wrapped in a linen shroud. The orifices might be plugged with cloth to prevent fluids from leaking out as decomposition began. During this process, the women handling the body would be exposed to any diseases the person had died from. If the death was from plague, typhus, or another infectious disease, the layers out were at high risk of contracting the illness themselves. Many women who made their living preparing bodies for burial died from diseases they contracted while handling corpses. But the work had to be done, and someone had to do it. After the wake, the body would be taken to the church for a funeral service, and then to the churchyard for burial. In medieval Europe, burial in consecrated ground, land that had been blessed by the church, was considered essential for the salvation of the soul. This meant that almost everyone was buried in churchyards, the land surrounding parish churches. Over time, these churchyards became extremely crowded, with bodies buried in layers, sometimes just a few feet apart. The constant burial of bodies in churchyards created serious sanitation problems. As bodies decomposed, they released fluids and gases that contaminated the soil and groundwater. The smell from churchyards, particularly in summer or after heavy rains that disturbed the soil, could be overwhelming. Flies and other insects were attracted to the decomposing bodies, and rats would burrow into graves to feed on corpses. In crowded urban churchyards, the problem was even worse. Space was limited, and new graves often disturbed old ones. Gravediggers would frequently encounter bones and partially decomposed bodies from previous burials. These remains would be collected and stored in charnel houses, buildings or crypts where bones were stacked to make room for new burials. Some charnel houses were elaborately decorated with skulls and bones arranged in artistic patterns, serving as memorials and reminders of mortality. The practice of burying bodies in and around churches meant that the living were constantly in close proximity to the dead. Churches were built over crypts filled with bodies. Churchyards where people walked, children played, and markets were sometimes held were essentially mass graves. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was much more permeable in medieval society than it is today. During times of epidemic disease, the normal burial practices broke down entirely. When plague struck a city, people died faster than they could be buried. Bodies would pile up in homes, in streets, and in churches. The smell of death would hang over the entire city. Gravediggers couldn't keep up with the demand, and mass graves would be dug where dozens or even hundreds of bodies would be thrown in together, often without coffins or shrouds. The psychological impact of these mass deaths was devastating. People watched their family members die, sometimes within hours of showing the first symptoms. They saw bodies piled in carts and hauled away to mass graves. They lived with the constant fear that they would be next. The normal rituals of death and mourning were abandoned in the face of overwhelming mortality, adding psychological trauma to the physical horror. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350 was the most catastrophic epidemic in European history, killing somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population. In some cities, the death toll was even higher. The sheer number of bodies overwhelmed all attempts at proper burial. Contemporary accounts describe bodies lying in the streets, houses full of corpses with no one left alive to bury them, and mass graves that were filled and covered over, only to be reopened days later when more space was needed. The handling of plague victims' bodies was particularly dangerous because people didn't understand how the disease was transmitted. They knew that plague seemed to spread from person to person, so they tried to avoid contact with the sick and the dead. But they didn't know about the role of fleas and rats, so their precautions were often ineffective. People who handled plague corpses, gravediggers, priests, and family members, were at high risk of contracting the disease themselves. Some cities tried to implement public health measures during plague outbreaks. They would require that bodies be buried quickly, that houses where plague victims had died be marked and avoided, and that clothing and bedding from plague victims be burned. These measures had some effect, but they were often implemented too late and were difficult to enforce. And because people didn't understand the true mechanism of plague transmission, the measures didn't address the real problem, the rats and fleas that were spreading the disease. The disposal of animal carcasses was another sanitation challenge. Horses, cattle, pigs, and other animals died regularly, and their bodies had to be disposed of. In rural areas, dead animals might be buried or left in fields to decompose naturally. In cities, they were supposed to be taken outside the city walls to designated dumping areas, but this rule was often ignored. Dead animals would be left in streets, thrown into rivers, or dumped in convenient but inappropriate locations. The presence of decomposing animal carcasses in and around cities attracted scavengers, dogs, pigs, rats, and birds that would feed on the remains. This created a cycle of filth and disease, as the scavengers themselves became vectors for disease transmission. The smell from decomposing animals added to the general stench of medieval cities and contributed to the belief that disease was caused by bad air. Butchers and tanners, whose work involved killing animals and processing their carcasses, created particular sanitation problems. Butchers would slaughter animals in their shops or in public markets, and the blood, entrails, and other waste would be thrown into the streets or into nearby rivers. Tanners, who processed animal hides into leather, used urine and other noxious substances in their work, creating terrible smells and polluting water sources. These trades were often restricted to certain areas of cities, but the pollution they created affected everyone. The medieval understanding of decomposition and disease was based on the miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad air or foul odors. This theory was wrong, but it did lead to some beneficial practices. People tried to avoid areas with particularly bad smells, which often meant avoiding the most contaminated areas. They used aromatic herbs and spices to mask unpleasant odors, which at least made the environment more bearable. And they recognized that some locations were healthier than others, even if they didn't understand why. The church played a complex role in the handling of the dead. On one hand, Christian theology emphasized the importance of proper burial and the resurrection of the body, which led to careful treatment of corpses and the maintenance of churchyards. On the other hand, the church's insistence that everyone be buried in consecrated ground led to the overcrowding of churchyards and the sanitation problems that resulted. The church also provided some of the only organized responses to epidemic disease. Monasteries and convents often served as hospitals, caring for the sick and dying. Priests would visit plague victims to provide last rites, even though this put them at great risk of infection. Many clergy died during plague outbreaks, but their willingness to serve the sick and dying provided some comfort and support during times of crisis. The long-term health effects of living in close proximity to decomposing bodies were significant. The contamination of soil and groundwater with decomposition products contributed to the spread of disease. The psychological impact of constant exposure to death and decay affected people's mental health and outlook on life. The normalization of death and the casual treatment of corpses during plague outbreaks may have contributed to a general coarsening of society and a devaluation of human life. If you had lived in the Middle Ages, you would have been surrounded by death in ways that modern people rarely experience. You would have attended wakes where decomposing bodies were displayed in homes. You would have walked through churchyards that were essentially mass graves. You would have witnessed plague outbreaks where bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. You would have lived with the smell of death as a constant presence in your environment. And you would have accepted all of this as normal because you had no alternative and no understanding of how things could be different. The stench of death was one of the most pervasive and disturbing aspects of medieval life. It was a constant reminder of mortality, a source of disease and contamination, and a challenge that medieval society never fully solved. The handling of the dead reveals both the limitations of medieval sanitation and the profound differences between medieval and modern attitudes toward death, disease, and the human body. As we reach the end of our journey through the filthy, fascinating world of medieval hygiene, the inescapable truth becomes clear. Medieval people lived in conditions that we would find not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous to health and well-being. The lack of understanding about disease transmission, the primitive infrastructure for sanitation, the scarcity of resources, and the cultural attitudes toward the body and cleanliness all combined to create an environment where disease flourished and life expectancy was short. But it's important to recognize that medieval people were not ignorant or indifferent to hygiene. They did care about cleanliness, and they made efforts to stay clean within the constraints of their knowledge, resources, and cultural context. They bathed when they could. They tried to control parasites. They disposed of waste as best they could. And they developed social norms and practices around cleanliness that made sense in their world. The problem wasn't that medieval people were stupid or lazy. The problem was that they lacked the scientific knowledge and technological infrastructure that we take for granted today. They didn't understand germ theory, so they didn't know that invisible microorganisms were causing disease. They didn't have indoor plumbing, so they couldn't easily access clean water or dispose of waste safely. They didn't have modern medicine, so they couldn't treat infections or prevent diseases. They were doing the best they could with what they had. The medieval experience with hygiene had profound consequences that shaped the course of history. The diseases that flourished in unsanitary conditions, plague, typhus, dysentery, and many others, killed millions of people and shaped demographic, economic, and social developments. The Black Death alone killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, fundamentally altering the balance between labor and capital, weakening feudalism, and contributing to the social and economic changes that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the modern world. The lack of effective sanitation also affected military campaigns, political stability, and economic development. Armies were often defeated more by disease than by enemy action. Cities were periodically devastated by epidemics that disrupted trade and commerce. The constant burden of illness reduced productivity and shortened lives, limiting human potential and economic growth. But the medieval period also saw important developments in hygiene and sanitation that laid the groundwork for future improvements. The construction of aqueducts, sewers, and public fountains in some cities showed that infrastructure solutions were possible. The regulation of bathhouses, butchers, and other trades that affected public health demonstrated an understanding that sanitation was a collective concern that required government intervention. The medical texts that discussed hygiene and disease, while often wrong in their details, showed that people were thinking about these issues and trying to understand them. The gradual improvement in hygiene practices over the course of the medieval period and into the early modern era was driven by several factors. The devastating impact of plague and other epidemic diseases created pressure to find solutions. The growth of cities made sanitation problems more acute and more visible, forcing authorities to take action. The development of new technologies like better soap-making techniques and improved water supply systems made it easier to maintain cleanliness. And the slow accumulation of practical knowledge about what worked and what didn't led to incremental improvements. The real breakthrough in hygiene and sanitation came in the 19th century with the development of germ theory and the public health movement. Once scientists understood that diseases were caused by microorganisms that could be transmitted through contaminated water, food, and person-to-person contact, it became possible to develop effective strategies for prevention. The construction of modern sewer systems, water treatment plants, and public health infrastructure transformed urban life and dramatically reduced mortality from infectious diseases. The contrast between medieval and modern hygiene is stark and sobering. We live in a world where clean water flows from taps, where waste is disposed of invisibly and efficiently, where soap and shampoo are cheap and readily available, where dental care can prevent tooth decay and treat problems before they become serious, where parasites are rare and easily treated, and where epidemic diseases are controlled through vaccination and public health measures. We take all of this for granted, but it represents an enormous achievement that required centuries of effort and the contributions of countless scientists, engineers, physicians, and public health workers. Understanding medieval hygiene helps us appreciate how far we've come and how much we owe to those who developed the knowledge and infrastructure that make modern life possible. It also reminds us that progress is not inevitable, and that the gains we've made can be lost if we don't maintain and improve our public health systems. In many parts of the world today, people still live in conditions that are not so different from medieval Europe, lacking access to clean water, adequate sanitation, and basic health care. The lessons of medieval hygiene are still relevant. The medieval approach to hygiene also raises interesting questions about cultural attitudes toward the body, cleanliness, and disease. Medieval people had different concepts of what it meant to be clean, different priorities in allocating scarce resources, and different understandings of the relationship between physical and spiritual purity. These differences remind us that hygiene is not just a matter of objective scientific facts, but is also shaped by cultural values, social structures, and economic constraints. If you had been transported back to medieval Europe, you would have struggled enormously with the hygiene challenges of daily life. You would have found it difficult to stay clean without modern soap, hot running water, and washing machines. You would have been disgusted by the waste in the streets, the smell of the cities, and the constant presence of parasites. You would have been terrified by the prevalence of disease and the lack of effective medical treatment. And you would have been frustrated by the lack of understanding about how disease spread and how it could be prevented. But you might also have been impressed by the resilience and ingenuity of medieval people, who managed to survive and even thrive in conditions that we would find intolerable. You might have appreciated the social aspects of bathing in public bathhouses, the communal efforts to maintain some level of cleanliness, and the practical wisdom that people developed through centuries of experience. And you might have gained a new appreciation for the enormous progress that has been made in hygiene and public health over the past few centuries. The filthy truth about medieval hygiene is that it was indeed filthy by modern standards, but it was also more complex and nuanced than the stereotypes suggest. Medieval people did care about cleanliness. They did make efforts to stay clean, and they did develop practices and infrastructure that represented the best they could do with the knowledge and resources available to them. The fact that their best wasn't good enough by modern standards doesn't mean they were ignorant or indifferent. It means they were limited by the constraints of their time. The story of medieval hygiene is ultimately a story about human adaptation, resilience, and progress. It's about people struggling to maintain health and dignity in difficult circumstances, making the best of limited options, and gradually developing the knowledge and tools that would eventually transform human life. It's a reminder that the comfortable, clean, healthy lives that many of us enjoy today are not natural or inevitable, but are the result of centuries of effort and innovation. As we conclude our journey through the grimy streets, foul-smelling cesspits, and parasite-infested homes of medieval Europe, we can be grateful that we live in an age of modern sanitation and hygiene. We can appreciate the enormous progress that has been made and the countless lives that have been saved by improvements in public health. And we can remember that behind the statistics and the historical facts were real people, men, women, and children who lived, loved, worked, and died in a world that was far harsher and more challenging than most of us can imagine. The medieval world was a place where the simple act of staying clean was a constant struggle, where disease was an ever-present threat, and where the most basic aspects of hygiene that we take for granted were either impossible or required enormous effort. It was a world that tested human endurance and ingenuity in ways that shaped the course of history and laid the foundation for the modern world we inhabit today. The fire burns low, the shadows lengthen, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour. The medieval world sleeps beneath centuries of accumulated progress, its lessons about hygiene, disease, and human resilience still echoing through time, reminding us of how far we've come and how much we owe to those who came before us.